Paula, welcome to The Narrow Path. Thanks for calling.
The other thing that I'm really interested in that I was hearing you talking about is the reconstruction of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through many Bible studies in several years being taught by dispensationalists who just assumed it was a fact that the only thing that's preventing the second coming of Christ is the reconstruction of the temple and the Red Heifer. And
oh, yeah, the famous Red Heifer. Yeah.
Yeah, the Red Heifer. And I have so much trouble, figuring out why it's necessary that the sacrifice Christ made was once for all, why they argue that we need to the Jews need to have the sacrificial system started up again in order for it to fall again, and before it can start again, they have to get the Red Heifer. I just wondered if you know which passages. I've heard Revelation 11 where
he measures the temple.
Jacob, but Elijah and Moses are the two witnesses are standing in the temple grounds. Is that the only passage they use to argue?
No, it's not the only one. Very important passages in the Old Testament point, in their view, to the rebuilding of the temple. One of them is the entire last section of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48. 9 chapters describe a temple and its rituals, including animal sacrifices, Levites performing the sacrifices, and so forth. Now, what dispensationalists do is they apply those chapters to the future. That is, they say this is talking about a temple that will be built in the future. Now, they also look to Zechariah 14. Zechariah 14 talks about going to the temple and bringing sacrifices to the temple, and they apply that to the future also. So the thing is, there's a couple of places in the Old Testament that do talk about the temple and sacrifices, and these passages are often interpreted as if they are talking about the end of the world, the end times, and that is one place that dispensationalists get the idea of a rebuilt temple. Now, in my opinion, both Zechariah and Ezekiel are talking about things that have already come to fulfillment. So I won't go into that right now, but more important...
Well, just before the last caller, you were talking about things that have already been fulfilled and people assuming that they're going to be again.
Have a double fulfillment,
Are these
right?
passages in that category that you feel like these were prophecies that have already been fulfilled and they are not necessarily going to be filled again?
Right. These are prophecies that I believe have been fulfilled and don't need to be fulfilled again. They are not prophecies that dispensationalists see that way. They don't believe they have been fulfilled. They believe these prophecies have never been fulfilled. They believe that Zechariah chapter 14 is talking about the time of the second coming of Christ, and that it has no past fulfillment at all. They would say the same thing about Ezekiel. So those are cases where they're not actually looking for double fulfillment. They don't recognize any kind of fulfillment in the past. But the more important passages for them are in the New Testament. And while the New Testament never describes the rebuilding of the temple, it does describe the destruction of the temple. Now, here's where the stuff comes up. The destruction of the temple occurred in AD 70.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, people who are not dispensationalists very often would say, and I would be one of them, when the New Testament talks about the destruction of the temple, it's talking about the destruction of the temple in AD 70, because the New Testament was written before that.
Right.
There's a couple or more books that could have been written later. John's books could have been written later. Revelation could have been written later, but they could also have been written before. And in my opinion, I think the evidence is better for an early writing of the book of Revelation rather than the later. But that is disputed, and probably the majority of good scholars are on the other side of that from me, although there's plenty of good scholars on the same side I am. So it's disputed. But in my opinion, Revelation was written before 70 AD also, though that's not the majority opinion today. Nonetheless, all the other books, at least all the ones John didn't write, are written before AD 70, I believe. And so when they mention the destruction of the temple as a prophetic thing I believe they're describing the destruction in AD 70. Now, one of the places where a double fulfillment comes up for suggestion, I don't accept it, but people suggest it, is in Matthew 24, where Jesus was asked, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And he gave that lengthy discourse called the Olivet Discourse. This, the wars and rumors of wars were going to happen, and famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places, and false prophets and false Christs, and the abomination of desolation and all that. We have been taught by dispensational teachers, these are all part of the future tribulation period. But Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said they're all going to happen in that generation. Yeah. And most dispensationalists who've heard dispensational teachers have never, ever researched to find out whether those earthquakes and famines occurred before 70 AD. Well, they did. And they're established. Some of them are mentioned in the book of Acts. Some of them are mentioned in the epistles. Some of them are mentioned in the Greek and Latin historians. Some are mentioned by Josephus, the Jewish historian. I mean, there's plenty of documentation that those things that Jesus predicted happened before AD 70. And therefore, when dispensationalists hear that fact for the first time, it usually shocks them. And then they say, wow, so maybe it was talking about 70 AD. But couldn't it have a double fulfillment and also be about the end times? And this is where I think Barbara's question was coming from. If some prophecies have double fulfillments, and we now have learned that the prophecies that we always applied to the end times actually had a fulfillment 2,000 years ago, well, do we really have to give up our commitment to these things happening in the end times? Couldn't we say there's a double fulfillment? And that's why I said, well, there are some prophecies that have double fulfillments, but we would only know about it if we were told about it. We can't just make up double fulfillments whenever we want them, and the Bible doesn't tell us of any.
How would you expect, if they are actually prophesied as a double fulfillment, how would you expect that to read in the
I would expect something in the Bible to tell us so. In other words, you don't find that when you find a prophecy that has a double fulfillment, you don't read it in the prophecy itself. You read it by the New Testament writers telling you of a secondary prophecy fulfillment that has already, besides the first one. That is to say, I mentioned that there's a prophecy about Solomon, that he'd build a temple unto the Lord, he'd sit on David's throne after David died, and so forth. And the prophecy is quoted about Jesus in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5, excuse me. So if you're reading the passage in 2 Samuel 7:12, you're not going to find any hints in it that it's got a double fulfillment. I mean, in retrospect, now that we know about Jesus, we might be able to. But at the time that it was being uttered, there was nothing in the prophecy that would indicate there's a double fulfillment.
Okay,
it was fulfilled in Solomon, but then the New Testament says, well, in addition to that, it's fulfilled in Christ. So it's not until the New Testament writer comes along later, after the first fulfillment, and says, but that wasn't the only one. That was also looking forward to this. Now, I would say that all the prophecies we know of that have double fulfillments, the second fulfillments were in the first coming of Christ. There's nothing I know of in the Bible that has a double fulfillment where the second fulfillment has to do with something later than the first coming of Christ. But if there is one, we're not told. And if there is one, we just have to, we certainly can't teach that there is one because we don't have any biblical authority for teaching such a thing.
That's very interesting. I haven't heard that before. And
that's why you listen to this radio show.
It is why I listen to this radio show. And it does help clarify things because I was taught, it's that there would be a double fulfillment. And she always taught that it was like looking at mountain ranges. You see the near one, but then
the lower one is in the foreground, and the higher one's in the background, and you see both peaks, but you don't see the valley in between. That's a typical dispensationalist illustration. Yeah, well, bless her heart. I'm sure that she's teaching exactly what she believes the Bible teaches, and I know that when I taught dispensationalism, I thought I was teaching what the Bible teaches too. I don't hold it against anybody. So that they're teaching what they believe the Bible teaches. What I would hold it against someone is if they heard good evidence that what they're teaching is wrong and suppressed it.
Yeah.
But most people who are teaching dispensationalism have never heard that their view is not scriptural and never heard evidence. So I don't blame them for teaching it. I don't blame myself for having taught it the first 8 years of my ministry, because I didn't know any better. I was teaching what I was taught by others.
At what point did you start thinking, wait a minute, this is not really making sense. It's not really what the Bible says.
It was gradual. See, I didn't have the advantage of tuning into a radio show and having some guy say, oh, that dispensational stuff, that's not right. Everybody I knew and everybody I read and everybody I listened to on the radio in the 70s was a dispensationalist, including me. And but what happened was, as I was defending dispensationalism, more and more I began to see that the verses I was using to defend it, my defense depended on me reading something into the verses that wasn't there.
Right.
And I thought, well, sometimes you do that because the information is given to you somewhere else in the Bible, and it's only reasonable to read it into verses that don't say it if it's clearly taught somewhere else. So, I mean, that's not bad, but what happened was it took me a long time to realize that this verse that I was using to defend such and such a principle, it didn't really say it. So my assumption was some other verse must have said it, and that makes it okay to read it into this verse too. And over the years, one at a time, I saw that all the verses I used to support certain things didn't say it. And I began to think, now wait a minute, this verse doesn't say it, this verse doesn't say it. These are the verses I'm using to prove my point, and none of these verses say it. And I remember thinking in my mind, where is the verse that says it, so that I can then justify reading it into these other verses, because it's plainly stated over here. And it took years, of course, because no one was guiding me in this. I hope God was, but I was just doing my own biblical studies, reading the Bible. Eventually, I concluded there's no verses that say it, and that was years ago. By 1979, I was already an amillennialist, but I had become that by stages. First, I gave up the pre-trib rapture. That's the easiest thing to get rid of, because there's not a word in the Bible that teaches it. Although I had 20 arguments for it, I can't think of one verse that teaches it. And now I know of verses that teach against it. It took a while to find those too, just because I was seeing them through my dispensational grid. What happens when you've got a teacher? When you've got a teacher that is convincing you, and there are good teachers out there who are teaching dispensationalism, if they can present it well, then they fit your brain with a grid, and you see everything in the Bible through that grid. And so even if something doesn't agree with it, there's some way to make it agree with it. You can kind of shoehorn it into the paradigm. And if the teacher does that convincingly, you're happy with it. It's kind of nice to have all the answers, and even if they don't fit
and
well.
a pre-trib rapture. I mean, I remember when I was going through these studies, probably 10, 15 years ago now, it was like, okay, I like that. I don't want to be around for any of that nasty stuff, so yeah. I'm going with the pre-trib rapture. It just is a very comfortable...
Yeah. Hey, Paul, I've just noticed that my lines are full, and I've got very little time left. I need to talk to some of these other people.
Thank you.
Thank you for calling. God bless you. All right, let's talk to Frank in Richmond, California. Hi, Frank. Welcome to The Narrow Path.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for taking my call.
Uh-huh.
First, I want to say I think I find it refreshing with your demeanor with the callers. So my question has to do with listening to the last caller and your explanation to that. I wanted to know your opinion on eschatology, and I guess it would be the doctrine of the Red Heifer.
Uh-huh.
And fulfilling prophecy. I just wanted to see your take on that.
Okay. Well, there's no prediction in the Bible that there will be a need for a red heifer or even a temple in the future. Certainly not a legitimate one. Now, there are Jews in Israel today who are very interested in rebuilding the temple. And, of course, the red heifer, which was something that had to be burned to ashes. And under the Old Covenant, you had to burn the red heifer to ashes and take those ashes and mix it with some other stuff to make holy water, to sprinkle things. That would only be of any value if the temple was any value. I mean, there's no relevance of a red heifer except to the temple cult in Jerusalem. Now, the Bible does not ever indicate that God will ever have the slightest interest in the temple being used again. As a matter of fact, Paul has made it very clear that all the requirements of the law have been fulfilled. In Hebrews, it makes it very clear that Jesus' sacrifice is the final sacrifice. Now, sometimes when Christians think about the Jews building the temple again, I'm not sure what they think the temple is. The temple is nothing but a slaughterhouse. If they're thinking of it just as a Jewish worship center, that's what the synagogue was and is, just like the churches we attend. That's the Christian version of what the Jews have in the synagogue. The temple wasn't a weekly gathering place. The temple was a place where you'd go on occasions, annually or maybe more frequently for some purposes, to kill animals and burn their bodies and drain their blood on the ground and so forth. It was simply a slaughterhouse. Now, the purpose of all that slaughter was to provide in shadow rituals a foreglimpse of the sacrifice of Christ and his blood. Now that has come, it's very clear in Hebrews chapters 9 and 10 that there's absolutely no use for any other sacrifices, never will be. Jesus' sacrifice is good forever. And as far as the sacrifices go, they had to be offered by the priests. Now, the priests in the Old Testament were descended from Aaron of the Levites. But the Bible in Hebrews chapter 7 makes it very clear that Levite priesthood, that's gone for good. It's been replaced by Jesus in the Melchizedek priesthood, and he holds that office forever. You're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And the Aaronic priesthood is said to be in every way inferior to it. So anyone who thinks, well, we should build, the Jews should build the temple, start offering sacrifices, have the Aaronic priests, do their thing again. Those people they act as if there's never been any New Testament. And this is partly because, as you said, of eschatology. There are people who believe that the church will be raptured, and then after the rapture, the Jews will build the temple again and begin to offer sacrifices, and that'll be a good thing. No, it won't. It won't be a good thing for them to offer animal sacrifices. It wasn't a good thing for them to do it after Jesus died, when the temple veil was torn in two. The Jews were still offering animal sacrifices in the temple when Hebrews was written. They're saying, he said, they're no value. Just the fact that the temple gets built, if it does, I don't necessarily think it will, but maybe it will. If the temple is ever built again, it's in defiance of Christ. It's not something God is in. God's never going to live in temples made with hands again. He has a new temple made of living stones. There's no use for a temple anymore. All the things the temple was for were rituals that have their fulfillment in Christ. And so, the red heifer thing, it's interesting to hear Christians get excited about, somebody's breeding red heifers now, so they can now, anoint the new temple. Well, what do Christians care about a temple? It's an anti-Christian shrine. I mean, it wasn't before Jesus came, but when he came, it was the Sanhedrin, it was the temple priests. It was they who rejected Christ and had him crucified. And then God judged it by destroying the temple in AD 70. There's never any use. I mean, they can build it again, perhaps, just like Hindus and Muslims and other religions that reject Christ. They can build their worship centers if they want to, but Christians have no interest in it. So, we have to remember, sometimes people think, well, Judaism, that's kind of like almost Christianity. After all, not Abraham, but Moses and the Jews in the Old Testament, they were Jews. So, we like them. So they're kind of almost Christians. Well, almost is not quite enough. If you have opportunity to follow the Messiah and instead you don't, maybe you even crucify him, that's kind of not being almost Christian. That's being anti-Christian. It says in 1 John chapter 2, whoever denies that Jesus is the Messiah is Antichrist. Okay? Now, we think of an Antichrist eschatologically. Some people think the Antichrist would be somebody who persecutes Jews. Well, no, that would be the anti-Semite. That would not be the Antichrist. The word Antichrist in the Bible is defined as anyone who denies that Jesus is Christ. That would include almost all Jews today. Certainly, if the Jews build their temple, they're denying that Christ was the final sacrifice. They're basically thumbing their nose at Christianity and saying, you think Jesus is the final sacrifice? We'll show you. We're going to offer some more. We reject his sacrifice. So any Christian who gets excited about the idea of the Jews building another temple, well, might as well get excited about building a mosque on ground zero in New York City. I mean, it's just kind of not really something Christians have a part in or have a positive opinion of.
Good.
All right.
That's good. Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate that insight.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate your call. I'm off the air in about 20 seconds. So I need to tell you the Narrow Path is listener supported. If you'd like to help us stay on the air, you can write to the Narrow Path, P.O. Box 1730, Temecula, California, 92593. Or go to the website thenarrowpath.com.